Encounter is brought to you by the Broome County Council of Churches, where we connect compassion with needs as we inspire growth with dignity. You'll find us in special places throughout the community. For those who remain hungry, we provide meals. For those who are challenged, we build wheelchair ramps. We comfort those who are ill, minister to those who are confined, and we remain an advocate for change and understanding on behalf of every element of our community. Connect and inspire. Encounter the Broome County Council of Churches.
Good morning. I'm Jeff Kellam, the Parish Associate at the Union Presbyterian Church in Endicott, welcoming you to this week's edition of Encounter. Speaking of our church, a little bit of housekeeping here. This weekend, Bill Carter and the Presbybop Christmas Eve Band will be presenting Jazz Vespers at Union Presbyterian Church Sunday afternoon, December 8th, right this weekend. At 3 o'clock, and it's a little bit of Charlie Brown Christmas music by Vince Guaraldi, and then some Christmas interpretations, jazz interpretations of some wonderful seasonal music. So that's at Union Presbyterian Church at 200 East Main Street. It's the last of the bicentennial things, so 200 years and 200 East Main Street, easy to remember. Now there were a couple of other ways to open the program besides that self-promotion. One was that I could come in and take off my sport jacket and put on a cardigan sweater and zip it up, and then I could change my shoes into deck shoes. But since I don't have a deck, I decided not to do that. And then I thought I could come in and sing, "It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Could you be mine?" But I don't sing as well as Tom Hanks, so I'm not going to do that either. I may be the first singing host. Our topic today is the new movie, A Beautiful Day. Is it a beautiful day in the neighborhood or just a beautiful day? Beautiful day. We're not sure, but we're going to talk about it anyway because we have all seen it. And if our if our guests seem overloaded with Presbyterians, it's because Mr. Rogers was an ordained Presbyterian minister, but we'll have an interfaith dialogue about this anyway. My guests today are two people who, when they knew there was a Mr. Rogers movie, said they wanted to be on to talk about it. One is the Reverend Sabrina Slater from the Christ the King Fellowship Presbyterian Church in Spencer, New York, and then Rachel Helgeson. Remind me who you are. Rachel is one of our co-hosts and was on just last week, and one of your parishioners had said, "Are you going to be on every week?"
Here I am again.
but you've both seen the movie, and we want to talk a little bit about, not to give away the plot or anything, but to talk about the film and then Mr. Rogers' ministry and about children and about the church's ministry with children, what we can learn from Mr. Rogers. Let's begin with, you didn't grow up with Mr. Rogers. You didn't watch television when you were a child.
Yeah, I didn't really watch television as a child, so I didn't grow up watching Mr. Rogers every day or every week. But of course I am aware of him because everybody knows of Mr. Rogers. Yeah. But seeing the episode or seeing the movie and whatnot, and hearing and reading about Mr. Rogers now is not tied with a lot of emotional memories as a child that were formed.
Right, right. Okay. But Rachel, you did grow up watching Mr. Rogers?
Yeah, my dad is a Presbyterian pastor too, and so that was one of the programs that we were sort of limited about what we were watched. My parents are careful about that, but Mr. Rogers was top of the list.
Yes.
Yes, you can sit down and you can spend your time here, and even now my kids watch Daniel Tiger, which is a spin-off from the original Mr. Rogers, and they've taken themes from the original Mr. Rogers using Daniel Tiger, who's one of his famous puppets, and do the same thing. So it's been interesting to watch that. But my parents actually gave me a DVD of all the old Mr. Rogers things, and I plopped it in front of my 5- and 2-year-old, and they both just sat there just like I did.
Yeah.
Because he really gets to the heart of looking at you and also feeling like you've been seen, and also to be able to, my daughter will come in she's like, when I'm mad, maybe I should punch something other than like my brother. like Play-Doh or my pillow. And she actually did that after she heard him sing the song. And I was like, okay, Mr. Rogers, thanks for that. Like parenting 101, sometimes as adults, I think we forget about that too, you know,
Yeah.
and I think that he speaks beyond just your 2-year-old or your 92, that he speaks right to the heart
Yeah.
of where we struggle. So
I saw an interview with Tom Hanks by Savannah Guthrie, and she talked about her 5-year-old in the back of the car watching Mr. Rogers on a DVD as she drove, and she said that her daughter, and you know, we're looking now at someone 5 years old now, and Mr. Rogers was back on in the 60s and 70s and 80s, but he still communicated to the point where the little girl said, "Mama, Mr. Rogers says I'm fancy." And that meant a lot to the little girl. The film, interestingly, when I saw it over the last weekend, at the end of the movie, there was a smattering of applause. And then, as people got up, sometimes the movie ends, people get up and leave, and that's the end of that. People stood around and talked in the theater. There was chatter going on all around me, and I think a lot of it was from people who grew up watching Mr. Rogers. I think that's part of the big audience as adults who watched him. He is countercultural because of his gentleness, and I think people, you know, there was a great deal of suspicion about Mr. Rogers, and then there was one myth that was dispelled in the film was about whether he was a Navy SEAL. And how these things get started, I don't know. You know, it sounds it's like something George Carlin would have said on a comedy routine about Mr. Rogers, and it stuck. And there was this rumor that he was a Navy SEAL and a big tough guy. Let's talk a little bit about the film. We don't all have to be in the Film Admiration Society. Did you like the movie?
I thought the film was well done as a film itself. So I appreciated. So we don't want to give away the film, right? But I appreciate how they tied in just the storyline, and how it also, in a lot of ways, I think, tried to continue what Fred Rogers was doing with his ministry on not on Sesame Street, in his neighborhood.
Right.
And so it was also trying to break through media in a different way. So I felt that it was trying to also sort of continue the legacy of Mr. Rogers, but in a different media space. And one example, and I guess you can throw things at you if it's wrong to say it, but there's a point in the movie where he invites the journalist to think of who made him who he is, like who he's appreciative of because they have made him who he is. And he says, give me a minute, like do this in silence for a minute. And I wasn't watching a phone or a clock, but I guarantee you it was a minute. And that's a big risk to do in movie, because I essentially almost fight with my congregation, and they do it though when I'm saying we're going to have silence, and it's so unnerving and so vulnerable for so many people. So for a motion picture that has Tom Hanks in it to actually engage in silence, complete silence, not silence with background sound.
There was no music
there wasn't
background.
anything.
Correct.
Yeah.
It was just silence, and so I really appreciated that. And even the flow, right, is a flow that tried to mimic Fred Rogers' flow from the television series. So in that sense, I just felt that it was a well-crafted and well-executed film.
Yeah. Okay, I was struck by that moment too, because the theater was totally quiet. There was a cough here and there,
Right. Of course.
which may have been a biological involuntary urge, or it could be the discomfort of being quiet. You know, I don't know where these things come from, but for the most part, it was just very quiet, and that was unusual. You can hear in the neighboring theaters the boom, boom, boom of the car chases and explosions.
Yeah.
But for this movie, it was just very quiet and gentle. What was your impression?
I really appreciated it. I wasn't sure how it was going to unfold. I had a feeling it was going to be more Mr. Rogers' TV show, and they did bring that together in a very artful way.
Yeah.
But it wasn't the way I expected it to be. Somebody had said to me they felt it was like a Mr. Rogers episode for adults. But I felt like even after I watched it, my kids could sit through this and understand what's happening, which
It's not a children's film.
It's not a children's film necessarily. I wouldn't say that, but I think that they could, because they crafted it the way that Mr. Rogers crafts his shows, right? So they took that very seriously. And Mr. Rogers' shows were meant, I mean, he talks about that they weren't just meant for children, they were meant for adults too. So that takes a very special thing to think about, how can we be intergenerational? I think the film took that really seriously. Where are the points where we as adults forget where that flow is, and you know, and so I really thought that it was going to be a little bit different than it unfolded, but it unfolded in a way that I think was beautiful. And the other thing I was a little surprised about, they did deal with his faith, because a lot of times when you get to a film, especially with somebody like Mr. Rogers, it's so easy to just say, oh yeah, they did that, and then but they didn't go full into how he was ordained or what he was ordained, but they did spend time to say his faith was very instrumental to who he was and what he was about and why he was doing what he was doing. So, and I think that actually gave a space to what he was doing in his media ministry things too, to say that he never was putting that over somebody's head and beating it over them, but it was central to who he was. And there was another scene that really caught me. It was with the journalist and Mr. Rogers' spouse, and his spouse was like, "Well, this journalist was like, well, what's it like living with a saint?" Yeah. I was teasing you about being a legend, but he's used the word saint. You know, what's it like to live with a saint? And she said, "But he's not a saint. He has things that he struggles with. He has places where he has vulnerability, and as a spouse I see that and know that about him, but I also see him find space for himself to be with God and ground himself in that and who he is and be authentic. And so that doesn't make him a living saint, it makes him so human."
She also named that he worked really hard to be who he is.
Right.
And not in a putting on a farce or a face, but being that he worked really hard to be the kind man that he wanted to be, and that wasn't necessarily easy for him. It was something that he dealt with every single day.
Yeah.
And the people who worked with him said over and over, what you see is what you get, that Mr. Rogers is always Mr. Rogers. It's not a persona he puts on. When my younger brothers and sisters were growing up, Captain Kangaroo was the hour-long daily program in the morning. And that was Bob Keeshan, who also had, I think, a wonderful call to do a sensible, fairly gentle, though silly program sometimes. But he was Bob Keeshan playing Captain Kangaroo. Mr. Rogers was Mr. Rogers, period. When you talked about the movie seemed to be a Mr. Rogers show for adults, it dawned on me that I've told this story before. When I was doing radio, one of my guests was Hedda Sharapan, who was an executive producer of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. She'd come to town to do an event of some sort, and I interviewed her. And she talked about some fan mail that she often would go through some of the fan mail. And she said there was a letter from a woman who said, "Dear Mr. Rogers, you are a part of my day when I come home from work." She said, I come home, I put my keys away, I take off my heels, which we were talking about earlier before we went on the air. And she said, I go and pour myself a glass of wine, I sit in my recliner, and I turn on Mr. Rogers. And she said, every day, that's my decompression. And so this was an adult who appreciated Mr. Rogers and the not childish, but childlike fantasies and imagination that he put into his programs, as well as the educational components. And dealing with children's issues, it was a stunning marriage of all the things that a good parable is. And I think that's, to me, the one other quick thing, personal. When I would come home from my work at the end of the day, my children were 4 years apart. So my daughter, the older one, had pretty much graduated from Mr. Rogers and was more into the Green Acres old sitcoms and reruns that were on in the afternoon. My son, though, 4 years younger, liked Mr. Rogers. So we had to do this, one day you can watch Green Acres or Bewitched or whatever it was, and the next day we have to watch Mr. Rogers. When I would come home, the day Mr. Rogers was on, things were pretty serene and quiet at the house. But when the laugh track was on, the other days of the week, there was a little bit more frenetic energy in the house. So I think Mr. Rogers had that calming and very honest attitude toward children and the adults who happened to kind of look over their shoulders and keep an ear out for what he had to say. We should point out this is not a biopic. This does not begin with Mr. Rogers' life when he was an overweight child, bullied. It does not go into what led him into ministry. It did not go into a lot of the early personal stories. It's about a reporter who's kind of a hardened writer for Esquire magazine who is called upon to write a profile of Mr. Rogers in 400 words for an issue on heroes. And so as he gets his 400 words, he wants another 400 and more. And then because of the reporter's personal issues, Tom Junod, I think is what we agreed was his name, he then finds that Mr. Rogers is kind of fascinating. I think he keeps looking for the chink in the armor, and Mr. Rogers is just dealing with him as a pastoral counselor. On the other hand, there is this, Mr. Rogers is, as I mentioned, countercultural. I think women appreciated Mr. Rogers more than men did. I think a lot of men were kind of threatened by his gentleness and wondered, what's this guy's angle? I mean, more than one Facebook response to the movie's been, I still think it was weird. Still think it was odd. An odd duck. And someone has pointed out, and maybe it was Tom Hanks in an interview, said, Mr. Rogers wasn't talking to you. Mr. Rogers was talking to children. And so if you can't hear him as a child hears him, then of course you're not going to get it.
But it's interesting, though, because he spoke on the floor of a Senate.
Yes.
To a man who was known for being vitriol and hard, and a senator that basically nobody wanted to talk to. And he stood on the floor, he was speaking, I think, on for PBS with the Child
they would
Defense
take funding
Fund
away.
doing funding, and they were going to take all this funding away. And he's like, I have this whole thing. I mean, you can find it, the video on YouTube, and he just spoke like he does to children, and the man ended up like almost in tears. And so I think sometimes we can feel threatened, but it also speaks right to the core of the things that we struggle to name in ourselves, to sit in that silence, right, of our very being. Mr. Rogers puts us in that can also put you on edge, which I think the film deals with that edge part, because
But I think it's interesting that, because I hadn't noticed a gendered response, but I'm not doing quite the same research that you would for this, right? But it makes complete sense to me when you have Fred Rogers, who is challenging what it means to be a man in a lot of ways: masculinity, what is strength, what is meekness, what is weakness, and offering something different. And for somebody who's already been formed by our culture saying, like, it's wrong for men to cry and it's inappropriate for men to talk about emotions or to be grounded or rooted or aware of what's going on. Like, oh, I'm angry. This is like, I'm angry about this, or I'm sad about this, and this is why I'm engaging in this way. They should be not appreciative. He's weird. There's something weird because he doesn't fit this box, and he's himself, he's kind, he's married, he's raising his children. He doesn't name himself necessarily as a perfect parent. He doesn't name himself necessarily as a perfect spouse. And yet it seems that he also had very healthy relationships with his family. I don't know of any weird situations with Mr. Rogers that I feel like would have been absolutely reported, right? Sure. So you just have this really gentle, engaging man who's fully embodied as himself. And of course, anybody who is fully embodied and owning whom they are, and he also is owning that he's beloved of God, is very threatening to anyone who's too scared to feel beloved or own who they are. Because there's a threat of rejection if we are who we are. And then how do we work through that? And Mr. Rogers would be like, you are beloved. So let's work through that, because just because you're beloved doesn't guarantee that people who you want around you will stay in your life, whether by choice or by death. You know, so I hadn't noticed that response, but it makes sense to me, and it also makes sense why children, though, would be more open, because they've had less years of being told this is what it means to do this, and this is what it means to be that.
Yeah. And we do live in a different age now, you know, 30 years or 40 past the entry of Mr. Rogers onto the television scene. Things have changed.
Right.
We have new issues which he would be dealing with, but some of the issues that were quite controversial back then, we've not gotten over them, but I think we've made a lot of progress. So I think you know, it would be interesting for a new Mr. Rogers to come on the scene, or a Mrs. Rogers, and to see how that person developed a sense of personhood within the child, and the child within me too, and not just the child within my children or my grandchildren. The film,
I would say, though, I think part of the invitation and even part of the presentation in the movie is that Fred Rogers is this extraordinary but ordinary man, and we're all invited to be that. And as much as he was brilliant and he was engaging, I just really think he loved people, and he felt that everyone should be seen. And he took that seriously. Everybody needs to be seen. So whether you're talking to a child or a grown person, they'll respond to that, is my experience. And I think that's what you see in Mr. Rogers, that he was willing to be deliberate enough and slow enough to see the person in front of him right then.
And to pay ultimate attention. He didn't bring things back to himself. He was a listener. And when you spoke with him, you realized he's looking at you, and he's seeing inside, and now the next question is a follow-up to, you know, tell me about your father. Or tell me about this, tell me about that. And we don't do a lot of tell me about it. We want to tell about, you know, we want to be the person who's doing all the talking, and a lot of folks do have the habit of having a conversation but always drawing it back to them.
And the film, I felt, dealt with that really well. Each character that Mr. Rogers came in contact with, right at the beginning, there's a child and there's a situation with that child. I don't want to give all that away, but he spent extra time. Almost to the chagrin of his staff. But he spent time, and then the reporter comes and wants to talk to him, and there's several different points throughout the film that he spends time with a reporter. And then the reporter's family becomes another part of that, and he spends time with each of those situations, with each of them in that moment, and honors it and makes it sacred, and gives them space. And that, I mean, that's, for Presbyterians, we talk about keeping the peace, unity, and purity of the church, but also to see each other as a priesthood of all believers. And sometimes I think we're like, well, that's a lot of big words. But for me, that was what the film lived out, is that he saw you, he sees me, he sees you. He gives space to just be authentically yourself, whether you're a child, whether you have limitations, whether that's you're older or younger, whether your life has taken you in places that you never expected it to. That's what's made you fully who you are and what you're about. And I think sometimes we don't want to deal with the brokenness of ourselves, particularly, and of the world, and that, I think, also makes you really vulnerable when you say, here I am a broken person, I'm from broken situations, this is me. And I don't know that there's a lot of space for us to do that in a lot of places, but maybe there should be.
We don't really want to own vulnerability as a gift, but it is one of the things that makes us human and interdependent on one another. If I have a weakness and you have a strength, then together maybe you have a weakness too, and I have a strength. And owning that and realizing that's part of what makes us community. Mm-hmm. And you know, Mr. Rogers was not a saint, but we talk about the sainthood, well, I call it the sainthood of all believers, but it's the communion of saints, mm-hmm. and it's being saints in the light. And mm-hmm. so when we celebrate All Saints Sunday, as we did a few weeks ago, there is a sense in which we try to live into our sainthood. And you know, God accepts us as we are. Mr. Rogers modeled that beautifully by saying, well, I like you just the way you are. Boy, and that works in a marriage, it works in a friendship, mm-hmm. works in a family, and it works in a community. So, any closing words about the movie? Is, even if you're not a big Mr. Rogers fan, or your kids weren't, I think it's still a good film. It stands on its own, apart mm-hmm. from that.
Agreed. I would just say there's this scene which was mentioned where Mr. Rogers is with the family of the reporter, and it's a hard time. They're thinking about death and dying, and he, in this point, I think really sort of embodies this pastoral space and presence. And he was just like, it was hard, folks weren't wanting to talk, and he essentially said, death is part of life, the hard is part of life, and anything that's part of life is mentionable, and anything that is mentionable is manageable. Yeah. And I think that ability to bring up the hard and be like, we can go through this, we can mention it, and that makes it manageable is important to remember, to hold.
Sabrina Slater is the pastor at the Christ the King Fellowship Presbyterian Church in Spencer. Our other guest has been our other host, who is Rachel Helgeson. As far as I know, she will not be on next week. Nope. She's the pastor at the Northminster Presbyterian Church in Endwell. And I'm Jeff Kellam, the parish associate at Union Presbyterian Church in Endicott, where we are celebrating our bicentennial. And the last of our events is this weekend, Sunday, 3 p.m., Bill Carter and the Presbybop Christmas Eve Jazz Band doing some Jazz Noel and Christmas music. We invite you to that at 3 o'clock. And we invite you to join us again next week at Encounter, which is produced by the Broome County Council of Churches with thanks to WBNG and the Town Square Media radio stations. I'm Jeff Kellam. We'll see you again next week.